The town of Willow Creek had a history, a dark, unspoken one that locals only hinted at in hushed tones. But for the Hughes family, the allure of a fresh start outweighed any reservations. James and Lisa, along with their teenage son Mark and younger daughter Ellie, moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The house was grand, with towering ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling garden that had seen better days. It was a steal, almost too good to be true. From the moment they set foot inside, Ellie felt something was off. She was a sensitive child, always aware of the subtle shifts in energy that others overlooked. The house was cold, even in the summer heat, and there was a lingering smell like damp earth and something else she couldn't quite place. But what unsettled her most was the mirror in the hallway, a large, ornate antique with a silver frame, slightly tarnished with age. The first night, as the family settled into their new home, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. James brushed it off as nerves. "Old houses have their quirks," he said, smiling at Lisa, trying to reassure her. But Ellie knew better. As she lay in bed, she could hear whispers, faint at first, then growing louder. She covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, but the voices only seemed to get closer, until they were right next to her ear, hissing her name. The next morning, Ellie mentioned the voices to her parents, but they dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Mark, being the typical older brother, teased her relentlessly about it. But that night, as Mark passed the mirror in the hallway on his way to bed, he noticed something strange. His reflection was there, but it wasn't quite right. The figure in the mirror seemed off. Its smile was a little too wide, its eyes a little too bright. Mark shook his head, chalking it up to tiredness, but as he turned away, he could have sworn he saw the reflection wink at him. Over the next few days, the house's strange atmosphere intensified. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and cold spots appeared in odd places. The mirror, however, became the focal point of the family's unease. It seemed to draw them in, as though something on the other side was watching, waiting. One afternoon, while Lisa was cleaning the hallway, she noticed a faint handprint on the mirror, but when she wiped it away, the print reappeared almost immediately, as though someone on the other side was pressing their hand against the glass. Later that night, Ellie had a vivid nightmare. She was standing in front of the mirror, and her reflection was speaking to her, though Ellie couldn't hear the words. Suddenly, the reflection reached out of the mirror, grabbing her arm and pulling her into the glass. Ellie woke up screaming, her heart racing. Determined to understand what was happening, Lisa began researching the history of the house. She discovered that it once belonged to a reclusive family, the Wilsons, who vanished without a trace in the early 1900s. Rumor had it that they dabbled in the occult, conducting strange rituals in an attempt to reach the other side. The more Lisa read, the more she realized that the Wilsons had left something behind, something dark and twisted. The mirror, she suspected, was a portal, a gateway to a parallel realm. The reflection wasn't just a simple image, it was a tether, a connection between their world and something far more sinister. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. The house felt alive, pulsing with energy. Mark, now visibly shaken by his own experiences, admitted that he had seen his reflection move on its own. James, ever the skeptic, tried to keep everyone calm, but even he was beginning to feel the strain. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, Ellie was gone. Panic set in as they searched the house, calling for Ellie, but she was nowhere to be found. Then Lisa noticed something horrifying. The mirror in the hallway had changed. Instead of reflecting the room, it now showed a dark, twisted version of it, with Ellie standing inside, her face pale and terrified. Without thinking, Mark ran towards the mirror, but James held him back. "We need to think this through," he said, though his voice was trembling. Lisa, however, was already moving. She approached the mirror, placing her hand against the cold glass. To her shock, her hand passed through it, as though the glass had turned to liquid. Realizing this was their only chance, the family held hands and stepped into the mirror. They found themselves in a distorted version of their home. The air was thick and cold, and the house seemed to stretch and twist, the angles all wrong. Shadows moved on their own, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening. As they made their way through the house, they saw glimpses of the Wilson family, pale, gaunt figures, trapped in this nightmarish realm. They were the Tethered, bound to this place by the mirror's curse. Finally, they found Ellie, huddled in a corner, surrounded by the Tethered. But when they reached her, they realized with horror that this wasn't Ellie. It was her reflection, a twisted doppelganger that smiled at them with malevolent glee. The real Ellie was still out there, somewhere in this nightmare. They had to find her before it was too late. As they searched for Ellie, the house began to close in on them, the walls narrowing and the shadows growing more aggressive. They could feel the Tethered closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The mirror, they realized, was the key. If they could destroy it, they might be able to break the curse. BT, as they reached the mirror room, they were confronted by the Tethered versions of themselves, each one a twisted reflection of their fears and insecurities. James's reflection was cruel and mocking. Lisa's was cold and emotionless, and Mark's was violent, filled with rage. In the midst of this confrontation, they saw the real Ellie, trapped within the mirror, banging on the glass, her eyes wide with fear. Desperate, James grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The Tethered screamed, their forms dissolving into shadows as the mirror was destroyed. When the light faded, the family found themselves back in their own home, the mirror now a shattered ruin on the floor. Ellie was lying unconscious in the middle of the room, but she was alive. As they gathered around her, she opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," Lisa whispered, holding her daughter close. "We're safe now." But as they stood up to leave, Mark noticed something in the corner of his eye. A flicker, a movement in the shards of glass on the floor. He looked closer, and his blood ran cold. In the reflection of one of the shards, he saw his own face, staring back at him. But it wasn't him. The reflection smiled, a slow, creeping grin before fading into darkness. The curse wasn't broken. It had simply found a new tether.